All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday. Is it Saturday? Time for me just keeps not being understood. Anyways, we're here with Amelia Possanza. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I'm going to give like a little intro to you just so the people can get to know you better. I am reading directly from your website, so you probably wrote this yourself. Amelia Possanza is a full-time book publicist and part-time writer. She currently lives in Brooklyn with her cat and has appeared in the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, Electric Literature, The Millions, and NPR's Invisibilia. Her first book, Lesbian Love Story, which was our July nonfiction pick, came out from Catapult in May 2023. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's I love that you read my bio that says I'm a book publicist. I feel like that's the role that I usually am talking to you in. And so
Yeah.
I'm to be excited to talk to you as an author.
So for background for those on the call, Amelia and I have been emailing for like over 2 years now. She works for Flatiron, right? And their books are absolutely incredible. One of the ones that we really collabed on for Sapph-Lit was Yerba Buena by Nina LaCour. And Nina LaCour told me that you were coming out with a book called Lesbian Love Story. And I was like, oh, that's going to be a Sapph-Lit pick. That has to be a Sapph-Lit pick because the title, I mean, the hat that you're wearing, it just all corresponded to be a perfect nonfiction pick for us. And I loved the book so deeply. So I can't wait to ask you all my burning questions. But to start us off, you mentioned it in your bio, you're a book publicist. How has that experience in publishing helped or hurt your own book publishing experience?
Well, when I thought about this project, like after I had finished it, I started to like psychoanalyze myself a little bit, which I hear from other writers is common. And I was like, what was I up to? And I was like, oh, I really was telling other people's stories and like using a lot of their own words and just trying to like share stories. And I was like, oh, I was kind of being a publicist, even, I mean, that's not the publishing process, but even in the writing process, I was being a little bit of a publicist because so much of my job is getting excited about other people's stories and trying to like uplift them and tell other people all about them. And it wasn't until I finished that I was like, oh, I was like out there publicizing for lesbians.
Do you feel like when you were writing, you were like, because one of my things with writing is that I constantly edit while writing, which isn't writing. I feel like that must be part of the process for someone who's a publicist. And like I work in marketing, so it's like kind of the same shtick.
Well, I think that's what's nice. My mom, when I first started in publishing like 10 years ago, was like, okay, but when are you going to become an editor? You know, and I was like, no, like publicist is a separate job. It's
Mm-hmm.
one with a career track. And I'm kind of glad that I didn't become an editor because I think I either would have like taken my author's books and been like, great job, but here's how I would have written it. And you should do
Mm.
or I think I would have like sat down to write and sort of like heard all of the voices of the other editors in my head. I think there's something nice about being a publicist because a big part of my job is just being excited and finding things to get excited about in a book,
Yeah.
in an author's bio. And so luckily, knock on wood, like that it's not going to come for me down the line, but I feel like I didn't have a lot of that. I think I actually had the opposite problem where my editor was like, wow, you're too excited about, like too many of these details. Like you could
Yeah.
remove this whole sort of historical figure that you're trying to shoehorn into this chapter about someone else. She's like, you really need to focus. So it was almost like I think I wrote a lot and I wrote about a lot of people. And she was really wise in saying, okay, if you want people to read this book, you're going to have to sort of explain to your readers why you're taking them there and who you're choosing to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, that leads perfectly into my next question. Jesse, from our community was wondering who got cut because I mean, there are so many, like lesbians have been around forever. I'm sure you nerded out on a bunch of other people and wanted to include them some way. So, which darlings did you kill?
Well, when I first started this project, I'm from Pittsburgh, and I was like, who are the lesbians in Pittsburgh's history?
Mm.
And I did not get very far down that track, but I did read a lot of Rachel Carson, like the naturalist and environmentalist who's credited for sort of like telling everyone that DDT was bad and killing all the
Silent Spring. Yeah.
And she went to like an all women's college. She never married. She had this assistant, Ida. And I was like, what is going on here? But I eventually abandoned that because I didn't find any evidence that felt like concrete enough to meet my criteria. So I was like, that's for someone else to do. And actually, I was in Pittsburgh in June, and someone told me that they had heard a rumor of like a lesbian Rachel Carson book coming. And I was like, I need that. Please tell me who's writing it. Who else? Well, I'm here in New York. We're just talking about New York. And there was a woman who lived on Staten Island, like in the Victorian era, who just like was a photographer, and she'd have these house parties and like take pictures of her friends like dressed up as men. Or there's like a really cute one where there's like 4 of them in bed together reading.
Oh, that should be Sapph-Lit's like background.
And she just was like super queer. She was really into bicycling. She like joined the Staten Island bicycling club, because if you were a woman, that was the only way to like have independent transportation. She collaborated on a book called Bicycling for Ladies. She did all the
Sounds pretty gay.
And there was also like a love triangle where like Bicycling for Ladies, there was like the model showing everyone how to properly ride a bicycle. There was the author, and there was her, and there was a love triangle behind the scenes of what like ended up being a very dry book, being like, here's how to mount your bicycle, and here's how to like weigh down your petticoats so they don't get caught in the wheels. But behind the scenes
it was juicy.
I'm like, where's that story?
True.
And then someone was telling me like Josephine Baker, but like did briefly make it into the book, and she was like a Harlem Renaissance actress and later became like a movie star. But there's also a woman named Sarah Josephine Baker, who was a white woman, and she was a doctor, and she tracked down Typhoid Mary. And there's all these letters between her and someone who said that she's a woman-oriented woman, which is a sort of sapphic descriptor that
That's the original WLW. It's wow instead of Willa or whatever. Woman-oriented woman.
There were so many, and like in my wildest dreams, I'm like, I want this to become like the Fast and the Furious franchise, and someone else can write like lesbian stories like too.
Yeah, love it. So obviously this process for you must have taken years, a ton of research, and I'd love to know what your writing and research process was like in relation to one another. And also just very curious how you balance this with a 9-to-5. I mean, I get that question all the time. It's like, how do you balance Sapph-Lit with like also doing a marketing 9-to-5? I'm like, I don't know. So I feel like you're the first author that I've talked to who like also has like a full-time 9-to-5, or I'm just like, I just need to know, like, how do you do it?
Well, I feel like the sanitized answer is like, oh, we make time for the things that we love. And I'm sure that, you know, the truth is a lot messier than that.
Yeah.
And part of a thing that I didn't want to include in the book is I did a lot of this during the pandemic. And before Nina and I sort of like started broadcasting and recording, we were talking about sort of like what queer spaces there are outside of nightlife. And I think during the pandemic, I felt like, oh, I'm not meeting up with my community in person at all. Yeah. And I was like living alone, me and my cat, and I wanted something to fill my time. And so that was kind of when I spent a lot of time researching. And like 2 of the lesbians in the book left oral history interviews, so it did feel this intimacy of like, oh, I'm cooking alone for the 800th time in the pandemic, but I'm listening to Mabel Hampton's voice. So I think that really dark time opened up a space to do this. And I would usually like wake up early in the morning and write during what would have been my commute time. And then I sort of like left the evenings for more like research and like listening and watching stuff while I was cooking or just going about the house all alone. So I think that there was sort of a sad undertone to a lot of
it. But you like made like friends of these women that you were writing about in a way. Like these were the people.
My dead friends.
I can't. What struck me about Lesbian Love Story that I feel like distinguishes it from other like nonfiction sapphic histories is you took such liberties with like creating a kind of fictionalization of filling in the gaps and creating these stories and moments of what you imagine happened in between the archives. And I love that so much because I feel like, I mean, history is written by the victors. It's written by, you know, straight men largely. And that, of course, obscures sapphics. And like, that's why books like this are so important. And yeah, I think that, you know, history is fictionalized in a lot of ways already because of that lens and because of that bias. So I just loved imagining the joy and like how, you know, history doesn't write down love, it writes down war, it writes down conflict. So in these like really beautiful moments of like sapphic joy and sapphic love, you chose to kind of invent these scenarios. So I'd love to know, like, how did these scenarios come to you when you wrote them? Like what got you imagining these in the first place, and like that decision to really intentionally include them and call them out. What kind of considerations did you take going into that?
It's hard to remember back to sort of that early on in the process. Like I was just like, oh, this is happening. Yeah. But I think it was because I became really interested. Like Mary Cassatt was the first person that I stumbled across that I was like, yes, like this. And I was reading her memoir. And I think part of that was a really arrogant, like, yes, this one, because her memoir is just so sort of poorly written. And it was really hard to sit down and read it. And I was like, okay, here's a story that would benefit just from a little bit of editing and publicizing. And in it, she talks a lot about things like, oh, like sharing little kisses and love sayings, or like finding the greatest pleasure. Like there are all these euphemisms.
Yeah.
And she didn't sit down and write her memoir because she was like, oh, I want to and I'm inspired. There were actually two men who asked her to for their own press. And they kind of had this gross interest in sexuality and wanted to capitalize on it. So I think what got me started with these inventions was the idea that who knows, you know, maybe there is a manuscript somewhere where Mary is describing her like kissing and her declarations of love and her sexual experiences in great detail, and they were just Xing all of that out of the manuscript. We'll just never know. So it's like history is told by the victors, but it's also censored. And a lot of that censorship has been used as a way to say that these things never happened or didn't exist. So I think it really was with Mary that I was like, oh, she's saying love sayings, but I feel pretty strongly that we all know sort of like what these little kisses are, or they're like loving embrace. Like these are all really like familiar euphemisms. And so that's when I started sort of imagining, okay, what would it be like if she could have expressed that?
Yeah.
I think that's how the memoir came in too, because as I started imagining stuff, I was like, oh, I'm just ripping off my own life. But like, so I need to be honest about who I am and what my experiences are, because like that's my bias. And I need to admit that I'm like the biased historian and not all these other historians who never admit to their bias.
Yeah. And just like put themselves in the background as much as possible. But you're like, no, I'm in here. I'm discovering, you know, and sharing my discoveries with you and my reactions, which it made it so much more personable to read. And it was so lovely as like a whole to really celebrate that joy and like community, especially, and like how these women created safe spaces for themselves. Because I feel like, you know, with movies like A Portrait of a Lady on Fire, or like what's the one with Saoirse Ronan and Kate Winslet, or like Disobedience.
Oh yeah.
Ammonite.
I almost said Mennonite.
Ammonite. Yeah. Like lesbians have like all of these massive petticoats that they have to like, that doesn't how do I say this appropriately? Like you can't reach their coochie through all these fucking petticoats. Like it's so like heavy, and you know, there's like all this tragedy and trauma and forcing into heterosexuality, and it often ends in tears and tragedy. And here you're celebrating a lot of these women who, like, yes, have absolutely gone through traumas, but then, oh, like, you're showing how they've come out of the other side and forged new relationships and experienced love. So what was important to you to convey about this history that you're unearthing, and what what about these stories do you feel like is important to share?
Well, I think like because it was during the pandemic, I went into this being like, I want to find love, right? Like I want to find romantic love, and I'm really interested in these sapphics, lesbians who had like a great love. And so the first two in the book, Mary and Mabel, kind of have these big, like decades long love stories. But then I think that idea was actually like challenged by what I actually found and sort of changed partway through. And a lot of the love was, as you were saying, was more in community, and caretaking, and not just about finding someone's coochie. And even with Mabel Hampton, like she had this partner Lillian, and they were together for 40 years. And I was like, gosh, that's like so impressive. Like people were U-hauling back in the 20s, like who knew? But also like the oral history tapes that I was listening to while I was cooking dinner all alone in the pandemic, were between her and Joan Nessel, who was like
Yeah.
considerably younger, Jewish, founded the Lesbian History Archives. And like they kind of have their own love story in a way that's not
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
or romance. It's sort of like mentorship and preservation. And like Mabel went to live with Joan when she was older and her apartment burned down. And I was like, oh, that's like a very different kind of love. And like, I had never thought about it before, but in those movies that you mentioned, like a lot of these couples, especially like in the petticoat days, are very isolated, you know,
Yeah.
like literally in Portrait of a Lady on Fire, they're like, you know, in the middle of nowhere. And to find stories where it was actually like, no, like, you know, Mabel would go to parties full of people wearing slacks, and she just could like list off on these oral history tapes, like all these people who were lesbians. And Joan's kind of like, what about this person? Was she gay? What about that person? Is so delightful and different than I think this idea I had in my head of like, okay, if you were a lesbian before Stonewall, you couldn't talk to anyone about it. You had no friends. You were just like pining away for someone on your own. And maybe if you had the courage to tell them that you were into them, like you might have a relationship, but you didn't have a warm community. And I was like, wow, everyone actually had these like warm, supportive communities that helped them through the traumas that you were mentioning.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that definitely focuses like on those like earlier chapters in your book, like definitely the first two. And then you kind of go back like way, way in time to Sappho, and then you kind of return, yes, Sappho, and then you return to, you know, a bit more modern day, like, you know, Gloria Anzaldúa is someone that I read like as a gender and sexuality studies major, and you kind of go into the
People
80s.
tell you that she was a lesbian?
Hmm?
People tell you that she was a lesbian?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, every like I mean, I would always assume whenever I was handed a reading, I'm like, this person's probably gay because I was an NYU gender studies major. I was like, yep, probably a queer person. Um, but yeah, like getting into that background was super interesting. And then you go into like the AIDS epidemic, and then, you know, kind of ending towards the 90s. So I'm curious, like, what challenges were different based on the kind of time periods that you were working with? Like, what would you say was most difficult about each kind of time period?
The people at the beginning, I just had less to go on. You know, Mary, I'm like, I have this manuscript, and there was something, you know, there were pros and cons to that. There was something really romantic about this, like, search for her. And I ended up going to the New York Historical Society on the day that it closed, to like the last day you could get a research appointment because of the pandemic. And sort of like looking for her in the archives of this like philanthropist that she worked for, and like finding her handwriting and like her name and her lover's name like together just in some very like banal notes. So there's sort of a romance to that, but also I was like, okay, there's a limit to how much I can find out about her, and hence the need for more imaginings. And then I got kind of more and more nervous in the more recent decades because I was like, wow, like some of these people are still alive, or people who knew these people are still alive. Like, I can invent a lot about Mary and no one's going to call me up and say, oh, I know her, and that never happened. But like with Gloria Anzaldúa, a lot of people in her circle are still alive because she died quite young. And I have yet to receive calls from them, knock on wood. But I think I then felt more of the pressure of like, oh, these are real people whose, legacy I don't know, like besmirch. And with Mary, it's like, well, it's easy to be playful. Or like with Sappho, right? Like, who is going to come at me and be like, I have
as a direct descendant of this ancient Greek poet, you got it wrong. Yeah, no, that's so fair. And I mean, have you gotten any positive, like really lovely reactions from these communities that are still around?
Well, yeah, I've gotten two lovely reactions. One is the AIDS chapter that you mentioned is about this woman, Amy Hoffman, who lives in Boston, and she wrote one memoir about caring for her friend. And I love it. I was like, your best friend? She's like, no, he was an asshole. Like, not my best friend. And I was like, I love that you can feel that way about someone, who you invested so much caretaking in and who is no longer here. And you're like, I want everyone to know that he's an asshole. I'm like, great, got it. Like, that's going in there. And so she read it and she was very kind and had like, I had interviewed her and this and that. And she was just very sweet. She was like, I haven't thought about that time in a long time. And like, you really captured it. And she's like, and I feel differently now. Like, I think she had softened a little in her memory of him. But that was really sweet. And it's also just a sweet, like, intergenerational connection. Thinking back about like queer community, a lot of my queer community is like my age or like in their 40s max. And being in touch with Amy, it's like, a lot of her novels that she writes are about aging as a queer person when you don't necessarily have children or like a big family network to take care of. And I'm like, that's something that I've never thought about as like a healthy, able-bodied woman in my 30s. Like, so I love having this more intergenerational community. And then the more recent and like even more exciting one is that I actually found someone who knew Rusty Brown, the like drag. Yeah, it was wild. We had like a whole Zoom call and she's been like trying to dig up photos for me because she recently moved, again, like a lesbian in her 70s.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting because with her, she was like, oh, I think Rusty's life was a lot harder than she wanted anyone to know. And she kind of acknowledged that there was sort of like a difference in the way that I presented her, which was very much based on what she said. And then like the woman that she had known. And she actually picked them up in a taxi cab when Rusty and Terry arrived in San Francisco. She's like, no one else would pick them up because they like looked so gay. And like, here I am, like the only woman taxi driver picking them up. Like they came out to each other, they became friends. But that was really interesting too, to have someone say like, actually like, this isn't what I remember of her life. I think her life was a lot harder. She's sort of like, I think some of the stories that she told were like pure invention, which is maybe why I didn't find any evidence of them. But then she was kind of like, but like, why write that story?
Yeah.
There's no need to sort of dwell on like, I think there was a lot of like addiction that she encountered and being really like poor and destitute later in life. And she was just like, what you chose to focus on is like really an okay thing to go in the record. So that was nice too, to have someone sort of say my worst fear of like, you kind of got it wrong, but like, that's beautiful too.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of just goes back to like, history is fiction. Yeah, like what is nonfiction at the end of the day. It Wow, yeah, that's so lovely that you got to connect with them. I love that.
And I'm hoping it's like a connection that stays alive.
Yeah. I mean, there goes back to like the importance of intergenerational queer relationships. Like I feel like, I mean, I don't know any or have any relationships with queer elders. The queer people in my life are like 20s, 30s, largely. And to have, we read as a community Rosewater by Liv Little, and there are two, so good, and there are two queer elders in there, the main character's grandmother and a friend of hers who comes to the club a lot, and just the lessons that are learned from those relationships are so beautiful, and makes me envious of like that kind of relationship and guidance. And I'm like, oh, I want to be that to someone I want to be that to a baby gay one day.
I love the thing that Mabel sort of says over and over again. Like it becomes her catchphrase on the tapes where she's like, the dead take care of me. And so,
yes.
and like, I don't know, it gives me chills when I think about it, but it's like, there is so much wisdom. And I'm like, oh, sometimes I think I'm the first person to encounter a problem, whether it's like a dating problem or like the pandemic. And then I'm like, oh my God, no, there's all these people who've thought about this before, who have wisdom. I just need to like check my ego and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I have a few kind of like silly, goofy, funny questions. So imagine the women from your chapters all gather together with you at a fast food restaurant chain.
Okay.
What chain are you going to? What questions are you asking? And what do you think they would talk about amongst each other?
Well, I think that I would love to go to Popeyes. I'm thinking, in part because like I love Casey McQuiston. I love One Last Stop, and I actually live super close to the Popeyes that's in like the opening scene of that, where like all the friends live above it. So I think just like we need to make that a landmark. So we're gonna go.
I agree. I love Popeyes as well. That's like my go-to.
I get nervous when you're like, what would they talk about? Because I don't think they would like each other. Like, like Babe Diedrichson just seems mean. Like I'm so intimidated by her, and I can sort of like empathize with her need to be kind of like scrappy and competitive. But I'm like, if you walked into a room full of like other lesbians, like would you even admit, like would that be your moment to open up and be like, yes, what Betty and I had was like very special and romantic? Or would you just like shut down and come for everyone? And I think even Mary, like I think in my book I really focused on the positives, but there's like some negative stuff to be had. And Mary was really like dismissive of other queer couple. She was like, they're so promiscuous, and what Juno wants to have is like
the way that you chose like the most narcissistic lesbians to write about. It's like, oh yeah, they really would not get along. You're right.
Well, I think that it takes a certain level of narcissism. I'm saying this as someone who wrote a memoir. Like it takes a certain level of narcissism to want to set down your story. And like one of my criteria is like, I don't want to sit around speculating like whether or not Emily Dickinson, was a lesbian, because like one, that's been done a lot, and two, like I want people who admitted to it and embraced that and like lived a queer life. And on the one hand, they're really inspirational, but like on the other hand, in order to like have been daring enough to live that queer life and to like tell people about it in a time when it was not expected or accepted, is like, you probably were a little bit of a narcissist.
Yeah, you probably had to, I mean, definitely not a people pleaser in that sense. Like you had to say like, fuck it, like I'm going to live as authentically as I can, while still keeping in mind my safety. And, if that means steamrolling down other bitches, so be it.
Maybe I feel like Gloria would be like, what's everyone's sign? She used to have these like birthday parties that were all like, okay, you can only come if she was a Libra. And she's like, you can only come if you're also a Libra. And
okay,
then
as a Libra, I love that. That's such Libra energy.
And then she's like, okay, next year, maybe I'll expand it to like Libra suns and moons. But like, I really have to think about
that. An icon of our time, literally. I want to talk about the title because it is, I mean, also just like within the cover design, I'm such a visual person, and your book so clearly stands out on like a McNally Jackson display in terms of just like the colors, gorgeous, love the swimming energy. I'm also a water person, so I'm biased there too, such an ocean girly. I definitely want to, in terms of the title, lesbian love story, like it's very clear. It's and I say this with like love, it's very in your face. Like it's like it is there smack dab in the middle of the cover. And it is like, this is what we're talking about. This, there's no like obfuscation of what the contents of the book is. Like if you're reading that on the train, you're going to get a picture taken of you and it's going to be like that Subway Creatures like book covers roundup. You know what I mean? Like it's such, oh, I see your cat in the background. So cute. Oh my God, just hopped on the little shelf.
The jungle.
What's your cat's name?
Her name is Poppy.
Oh, I love
And in
that. Okay.
the gayest way, like she's a cat that I got with an ex, and we had a huge fight over what to name her.
So on brand. But yeah, like the title is very clear. It's very large on the cover. Was like keeping in mind the how lesbians have been rendered invisible in history. Was that intentional? Like, did you consider any other titles? Like what? Yeah, just like was that a message in a way?
Or, you know, I didn't realize it at the time, but unconsciously that must have been part of my reaction to working in publishing. Because especially like in my early days when I started, like, you know, over a decade ago, I would sit in meetings where people were like, well, this book is gay, but we want to make sure that it appeals to everyone, you know? So like, what are we going to say about it? Or like, you know, right before my first job was at Little Brown. And right before I started, they came out with this really popular book called The Art of Fielding by Chad Harbach, who I think is one of the founders of N+1. And, you know, like the cover looks like, you know, like is in like baseball jersey font. And the description is like, oh, you know, like at some like small town college, everyone's playing baseball. I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to read this book. Why is it so popular? And I read it, and it's really like a gay love story where everyone's obsessed with Moby Dick. Right. And I'm like, okay, if you had just said that, I would have picked up the book. But I can imagine the meeting that like happened before I showed up where they were like, hey, how are we going to get everyone into this? So I think a little bit of it was out of my frustration about that. I'm like, who is going to sit here and be like, okay, how are we going to get, you know, all the boys who read GQ to be into this book? And I'm like, you know, you're not like,
it doesn't have to be for everyone. It can be for the gays.
Yeah. So I think I did want to be very intentional and like raise a flag and be like, this is what we're up to. And originally it was actually the subtitle, because when I first was thinking about writing a book, I was like, I'm just going to write like a really angry essay about how gay men take up too much space in the world. I can't even look at you directly when I say that, because I'm a little ashamed. Because I'm on this, you know, speaking of being a water girly, like I'm on this big gay swim team. And when I joined, I was like, okay, you're all like cis white dudes who have like never met a lesbian in your life. And like, people didn't realize that I was a lesbian. One man like talked so much that he invented this whole story about me like dating a boy on the lacrosse team and then like going to the nearby women's college to like experiment with girls. And I couldn't get a word in to be like, no, I dated girls on the lacrosse team. So originally I wanted to call the book like Not That Kind of Gay, and it was going to be like a 70-page essay being like, I hate gay men, and then I got over myself and wrote a different book.
Okay, well, first of all, you're like not wrong. Like you're not wrong. I double negatived or triple negatived there. You're not wrong about the kind of taking up space, because I mean that's definitely true in terms of book publishing as well. Like I feel like only within the last year or so, since kind of the Evelyn Hugo boom of TikTok, like have sapphic stories really started to become published like en masse. Like it really took a turn. And then like Casey McQuiston, of course, came on the scene and like really shook things up for the entire like sapphic literary space. And now I see them coming out every week and it's so freaking amazing. But yeah, tell me about finding queer community as an introvert, because you have this queer swim team. You're going whale watching later with a bunch of gays. We're talking about before. Tell me about your experience, like cultivating your own kind of queer chosen family out of, you know, your kind of like little Brooklyn space.
Wow. That's really like a lovely question that I'm ashamed to say I've not thought about more. I mean, I think the swim team is a huge part of it because, you know, as I was saying before, like Amy Hoffman wanted me to know that her friend who died of AIDS was an asshole. There's something that I love about that, because like I think that there are so many moments that I was like angry with a lot of these people, you know, like the guy who created this alternate life story for me where I like dated guys on the lacrosse team. He then like hosted me in his backyard in Bed-Stuy for a cookout the day before my book came out. You know, like I love learning from them that having a moment like that does not end a friendship or a relationship. Like that becomes part of it, you know. And we've had a lot of conversations about like what he doesn't know or what he needs to learn. And like, you know, a friend flooded my bathtub, and this man is like in his 60s, and I didn't know what to do. And so I like called him, and he was on the phone with me for like 45 minutes telling me what to do. You know, I'm like, okay, you're my like uncle. I mean, he's like my parents' age. So I feel like a big lesson for me, and part of why I'm glad I didn't write the like I hate gay men essay is that I'm like, okay, you guys are really frustrating and you can be assholes, but that's not a reason to like kick you out of my community or
that's not the whole experience.
Yeah. And I feel like that's true of like traditional families too sometimes, right? Like you're related by blood, and so you like have to be forgiving. But it's been really interesting to like push myself to practice that with people that I'm not, you know, compelled to or forced to by blood. It's like, okay.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
The swim team, I think, is really the biggest one. And then, you know, there's like the official swim team, but then there's also a group of people who swim at the beach. And those are like predominantly women and really body positive people who like do not like look like traditional athletes, and who like literally I'm like, I'm putting my life in your hands, because like when you're out, they're like jet skiers, and you look out for each other. And it happens at 10 in the morning. So, you know, you don't need to be a night owl. Show up.
Love that. Yeah, I mean, I was talking about this with you earlier, like having queer community outside of alcohol consumption and like going out and staying up late because my bedtime is 9 p.m. has been so important for me. So I love hearing about these little pockets of queer community, especially in New York, since we're both Brooklyn girlies. So yeah, no, incredible.
10 a.m. queer community.
10 a.m. queer community. We're obsessed. Back to Lesbian Love Story. What I loved about like Joan Nessel is, I mean, just hearing her talk about Mabel was just so freaking endearing. And, you know, kind of going back to that like elder queer relationship. But part of the epilogue that really stood out, I think it's how you ended the book. She says the archives, the lesbian history archives, were created to break the concept of fame. What does that mean to you?
Well, it goes back to like where we started the conversation about history. Like if the victors are making history, it's going to be about big important moments like winning a war. You know, I hated history in high school, and I don't think I took any history in college, because I'm like, okay, you know, we've got this battle, we've got like, we're colonizing people, you know, like it's big events, and there aren't a lot of like people and characters in it. And I think like when I was talking to Joan, I was first of all so nervous to speak to her. And she was, you know, she lives in Australia now, she's in her 80s, and surprisingly we talked a lot about like the big issues that the world is facing today. You know, she did a lot of like your generation is like facing a lot of crises around like climate and income inequality and like violence born out of hate. And you know, she did a really interesting job of kind of connecting that to fame, of like, okay, if the role models that we have are like Christopher Columbus, and you know, if you're like growing up hearing about these people and you're like, okay, the way to make a name for myself is to be these people, then like it's not surprising, you know, to her that we live in the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of like the stories in the archives and that I wanted to focus on are very much about like, I don't know, resistance in the day-to-day, like through your community and in your relationships. Like I kept looking for more details about, you know, like Mabel and Lillian's relationship on the tapes. And there wasn't much about it because I think that she just accepted it as a fact of like day-to-day life. She's like, okay, I'm with you for 40 years. I'm not going to talk about like, I don't know.
Not exceptional to her.
Yeah, but it still is like such an important thing to model of like having a relationship with someone until they die and like pretending to be sisters so that, you know, no one would send you away to jail. Like, I think a lot of the kinds of resistance, and I'm just paraphrasing Joan here, and it's so cheesy, but I love it. But like a lot of the kinds of resistance that we are going to need to confront these issues facing us are not like, okay, we're going to have a big, like, we're going to go storm the Capitol, right? Like, that's not what's going to create change. It's like the interactions in our day-to-day life and how we all choose to live in our like much smaller communities.
Yeah, I love that. So the Lesbian History Archives, how does a New York girly get in? What's tips and tricks?
You can volunteer. You can, I think you can just go and visit. You don't need to have an official project. They have a calendar on their website of kind of like open visiting times. Saskia was like my main contact there. She's very nice. And they've also been doing some interesting programming. Like, I feel like I was out of town, but they had like a cocktail hour at the New York Public Library. Talk about like queer community. I mean, they did include the drinking in there, but at a library. And I think, you know, happy hour early in the evening. So I think they were shut down during a lot of the pandemic, and it seems like only now they're coming back around. And also just follow them on Instagram. They have like a lot of cute interviews that they do with people, or they share, you know, sort of like artifacts that they find. So you don't even have to physically go to enjoy all the resources that they have.
I love that. Such a good follow. Okay, last of my questions. So if you were to write Lesbian Love Story Part 2, 50 years from now,
wow,
who from today would you include? This is actually from one of our community members, Allie. Yeah.
I oh my God. my brain breaks. I mean, first of all, I'm like, would it even be called Lesbian Love Story, right? Like,
say more.
Like, I think I used the word lesbian in the title because that was the word that like almost all the people in the book used. Yeah. I like pledged it with Babe Diedrichson a little bit because I wanted to focus on someone who was like more closeted and in, you know, like in the limelight. But like everyone else, like that was a word that they used. Like some people also used dyke, and like, you know, Mabel in the Black community used stud. But I was like, okay. And now I'm like, okay, would it be like sapphic love story? Would it, you know, like, so I love that like the language is changing and that we have so many more options. Like these were people who did not have options.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Okay, so sapphic love story, 50 years from now.
I'm like, I'm going to need 50 years to think about this. Part of me is like, okay, Megan Rapinoe, because I think just like as a sports star, but also like women's pay equality, like so much. She's just like at the forefront of so much. When I also think like I have regrets about the book that I try not to think or talk about too much, but it's sort of like my unconscious bias, I picked a lot of like fairly like mask people, you know, and so I'm like, okay, I want this new book to have some like super high femme sex, yes, or even like femme for femme, because like Rusty's partner was really like a stripper.
Yeah, you were talking about like how they prescribe to traditional heteronormative like couple structures.
Okay, I want there to be some femmes. I want there to be like more trans lesbians. Like that was like a story that I feel like I didn't find or like couldn't even properly identify because, you know, like at the turn of the century, people didn't necessarily have the language to kind of like parse that out. So yeah, I'm thinking less of specific people. I would also want to just like have a whole chapter about like Taylor's like queer baiting, right? Like, you know, we can do like some Taylor Swift queer baiting, like deep analysis of like, okay, what happens when you start trying to market to queer people without putting your reputation at risk? I think that is something that's like so deeply fascinating to me.
As a Swiftie, I could talk about this for so long.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So interesting. Yeah, the Gaylor and like bi opposite Hitler communities. No, that's literally their name.
I've heard of Gaylor, but I had never heard of
Oh
Hitler.
my God, no, these are the people who are like the anti-Gaylors. They're like, Taylor Swift is straight. And anyone who suggests that they're gay, like, how dare you speculate and how dare you? Because she's definitely not. And obviously, undertones of homophobia in the Hitlers. But yeah, we're gonna talk about this.
Well, I think I could go off too about like another thing that like complicates the archive is like we are in an age that I don't think any of the like lesbians that I really wrote about were in, where there's such a level of fame where it's like, okay, I can't access Mary Casal because she like wrote under a pseudonym and no one's left alive. But it's also like I can't access what's going on with Taylor either for like very, very different reasons. And that's fascinating.
Yeah. Wait, so okay, you work for Flatiron. Did
Yeah.
you remember the whole Taylor Swift biography Flatiron stuff?
It was really the BTS book that came out.
Oh.
That was the conclusion.
I didn't follow up on that. But I mean, I really wish it was a Taylor Swift biography because there needs to be a whole Karlie Kloss chapter because the Gaylors are convinced she was in a 7-year relationship with Karlie Kloss.
Yeah. The other big like relationship that I follow is the like Harry and Louis from One Direction. Larry.
Oh my God. Larry Stylinson. I was on Tumblr 2012 reading that fic. I was, and I admit it.
And I'm like, that is a story that I cannot go to my grave without knowing. And okay, I also like,
I saw concrete evidence for it. The most concrete evidence for it thus far on TikTok. Louis came out with a song talking about wrapping his arms around someone while listening to Ed Sheeran in Manchester. And famously, Larry Stylinson was at Ed's show in Manchester circa like 2014 or something. That's all. that's the evidence.
I don't want to go too deep in on this, but also like I feel like there's this parallel in my mind between like trying to solve puzzles in the archive and trying to solve like celebrity puzzles. And I'm like, we need to get some of these like Tumblr girlies, right, who are putting together the evidence. We need to like get them into the archive, right? I'm like,
I feel like the Lesbia TikTok drama would definitely be in Sapph-Lit Love Story Part 2. Like the whole like JoJo and like connected to Fletcher and all these different girlies.
See, now I'm starting to feel old. I'm like, now we're getting to things
now we're getting
I don't know about.
To the Gen Z lesbian drama. Don't worry. I'll send you a video that explains everything. Okay, so moving on to the rapid fire round. These are short questions, short answers. So for those of you who are on the call and want to ask Amelia a question, if you have one, drop that in the chat now and we'll ask at the end. Okay, what are you currently reading?
Why not? Oh, I'm reading like Miriam Kaba abolitionist essays. We do this till we free us. I'm like, okay, it's time for me to like seriously learn about prison abolition. Because I do feel like with this book, I was like, I want to find a romantic partner. And then I came away being like, I want to destroy capitalism.
But also like the history of like lesbians in the prison system and how that cultivated so many relationships and like dynamics.
Yeah, like Hugh Ryan's argument is that like if you were, you know, perceived as a man and sent to jail, it was probably because you like, you know, like 80% chance that you committed a crime. If you were perceived as a woman by society and went to jail, it was probably because you were queer in some way, because being a bad woman was enough of a reason to be called like a prostitute and be sent to jail.
Yeah. Them bitches.
I've been doing some heavy summer reading. But I mean, I love it because
each read energy.
It's a collection of her like essays and things that she's published online. So I like it because there's kind of some overlap between the essays. And I'm like, oh, if I didn't get it the first time, like maybe 3 essays later, it will like actually sink in. Like I find the repetition helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Noted. All right. What is a book that you recommend everyone to read?
Oh my gosh. The Red Zone by Chloe Caldwell, because it's about periods, and it's about like her in her 30s being diagnosed with like PMDD. And I'm just like, guys, we don't talk about periods. I recommend it to all the gay men on the swim team. Like, there's this beautiful part where she interviews different people about when they first got their periods, and some people like got it for the first time in the 50s, and some people got it for the first time in like 2017. And like, there's just, it's really poignant how similar their experiences are of like shame and relief. Oh, we should all talk about periods more.
I agree. What is a book coming out soon that you're excited about?
Um, Gabrielle Korn's book. Now I have to like look at my shelf. Yours for the Taking. Okay, partially because my friend edited it. It's like sapphic and futuristic. I love that her last name is Korn because it reminds me of Feel Good when George puts May in her phone as Korn. And I'm gonna do an event with her. So it's like futuristic, sapphic. I think you get to like go to, you know, like the world is falling apart and you can go to this like, you know, you can go be saved in this commune. And it has like toxic lesbians, right? Like,
Yeah. I mean,
toxic
I would go to a toxic lesbian commune. That sounds fun. That sounds like a really good time.
Yours for the Taking, Gabrielle Korn.
Favorite class you took at university?
I actually took an oral history class, which I'm like, in hindsight, I'm like, okay, I see.
There you go. That was prepping you for this moment.
Book making, where you like, I'm not a visual artist at all, but I loved
that. Love. Dream dinner guest, dead or alive. And it can't be from the book. I saw that.
Now I'm like Taylor Swift, so we can get to the bottom of this.
I'm crashing that dinner. I'm 100% crashing that dinner. Okay, favorite Sapphic TV show and favorite Sapphic movie.
Okay, I am obsessed with the show Vita, which was on Stars. It got canceled after 3 seasons. I need more people to talk to about it. It's like really hot. It's set in LA. They're like 2 sisters who come back together when their mom dies. They realize that their mom was a lesbian and like running a gay bar, and they're also both queer. Like,
I need to watch this.
So good. And then was the other one movie?
Movie, yeah.
That's harder. I feel like I just like watch so much TV these days. I don't know if this has happened to anyone else, but I've just become less of a movie person.
That's fair.
I can't remember. I mean, I watched Barbie. You know, like Kate McKinnon.
That is a Sapphic movie. That is Kate McKinnon.
What about a utopia?
That is a toxic Sapphic comedy to go to.
Like femininity is uplifted. What would that be like? Also, I saw it with all the gay men from my swim team, and they walked away debating which Kens were hotter, and I was like,
"You missed the point."
See the same movie? Like, I didn't even notice like whichever background Ken you're talking about, and like the size of his package. Like, what?
I mean, side note, Ryan Gosling's song "I'm Just Ken" has been on repeat for me over the last week. It's really good. It's such a good hype up song. It's like just an 80s power ballad to the max. Okay, last rapid fire question. Favorite Sapphic to follow on social media?
Whoa.
Or like Sapphic celebrity?
I mean, again, I'm like really obsessed with Megan Rapinoe. For a long time, I was obsessed with Kristen Russo and Jenny Owens Youngs, who did this podcast about Buffy, and there was like a lot of behind the scenes drama where they were married, and like season 3 of the podcast, they got divorced. Kristen wrote really publicly about having a miscarriage, which was like so, because you know, we don't talk enough about periods, and like we don't talk enough about what like an emotional and like deeply private experience miscarriages are. And now they're like both happily married to other people. So yeah, I'm really invested in the 2 of them, and I follow both of them on social media. I don't know how interesting it would be to people who are not deeply invested in this plot arc, but I'm like, Kristen was really good friends with this singer whose name I'm not remembering, like a ukulele player, and like for a long time I was like, are they dating? Because like she was by, is it like Imogen's? Anyway.
This is your Lesbtopia drama. This is your version of JoJo Fletcher being connected somehow, like the L word. Like what, like mind map of sorts.
I mean, I also love following all of the Queer Ultimatum contestants.
Oh my god, So good. Who was your favorite?
I mean, I feel like post show, Ray is really like coming out on top because she like did this. She does just hilarious posts that she's like, why did like we think that we needed to be on a reality TV show instead of going to couples therapy? But I think like within the show, I just like loved Xander so much, and getting to like watch them realize that they could be like loved by someone who was not so toxic was really good.
Yeah. I also think that the Queer Ultimatum cast should have a chapter in Sapphic Love Story Part 2 in 50 years. Like that is truly lesbian canon.
Well, I think that like Sapphic Love Story would have to be so much. I would want it to be so much more like pop culture focused because they're just
because we have the internet. Like all of your people were what would your people do with the internet? How would they use the internet?
I mean, again, raging narcissist.
I feel like Sappho would go like a Rupi Kaur route and like do like little fragmented Instagram poem posts.
Like I feel like it's the Britney Spears vibe back when she was in her conservatorship, where there would be like a video of her like looking really happy by a pool.
Twirling.
Yeah, and then the caption would be something really cryptic, and it was like, "Do you need help? Like, is this a cry for help?" And I feel like Babe would just use it to like brag, right? About like, she'd be like, here are my muscles, here are my sports achievements.
Yeah.
I feel like Mary would do the thing where she like made Juno post exactly the same thing as her, right? With this, do you know couples who do this? I like still embarrassingly know couples where I'm like, I follow both of you and you posted the same thing with the same caption. And you both like wrote a comment on the other person's as if
you could just do a joint post, just do a collaboration. It's fine. There's that feature now. All right. Well, those were the end of the rapid fire questions. Does anyone have any questions for Amelia in the chat? If not, totally okay. I know it's weekend brain dead time, but yeah, while we're waiting for people to potentially type, Amelia, any questions that I didn't ask or anything you want to share with these lovely people?
I just wanted to say, like, thank you for letting me delve into these celebrity gossip stories, which I did not realize feel so deeply connected to.
I mean, that is how I connect with my queer friends, mostly is just pop culture goss.
When I feel like my only other PSA is like, go visit your queer archives, like, go engage with elders, go engage with people you don't like.
You with the guy on the swim team now being besties. Like go engage with people you don't change a gay man's mind.
Change a gay man's.
Put that on a hat.
Really old book that I love called, I mean not that old, but like called Why I'm Not a Feminist by Jessica Crispin, where she talks a lot about like the commodification of feminism and like, okay, if you're trying to be like Sheryl Sandberg, are you really a feminist? Like we don't need more female CEOs. We need like fewer CEOs, like no CEOs in general. And one of the things that she says in that book that has always stuck with me is she was like, when someone has like acted out in your community, you should like treat them the way that you want to be treated when you act out, because like inevitably that is going to be you someday. And like I think about that all the time.
I love that. Let's end there. Thank you so much, Amelia. This was just so lovely to get to see your face and chat with you over the last hour. I just so appreciate your time and all the work you put in to put a book like Lesbian Love Story out into the world. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. And maybe we're going to need to follow up about some Taylor Swift gossip.
Yeah, no, I'll also do some TikToks. All right, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your weekend.
Have a weekend. Bye.
Bye.